any quote-unquote fact is always subject to finding new information. I think down deep, the people on the other side know that we're right. That's why they have ferociously opposed any and every effort to do any and every scientific test to determine the truth. These people are not real historians. They're afraid. They're afraid of the truth. Here's a Xerox of one of the main articles, the Rolling Stone magazine article of July 1st, 1976. They really sensationalized it. A conspiracy theory to end all conspiracy theories. The startling revelations of young Nathaniel Orlowek. I'm Nate Orlowek, and for nearly 40 years, since I was 15 years old, I have been involved in researching the question as to whether John Wilkes Booth was really the man killed in Garrett's barn, and have ended up becoming the leader of the group of people who believe that probably he was not killed in Garrett's barn. The standard history is that John Wilkes Booth killed President Lincoln on the night of April 14th, 1865, and was able to escape out of Washington. And of course, Booth was with David Harold, his henchman. And while they were in the storage barn of a family named Garrett, federal soldiers surrounded the barn and demanded that the two of them surrender. Harold, by all accounts, did surrender, but the other man in the barn refused to surrender. They set the barn on fire. One of the soldiers put his pistol up in the air, shot. The bullet happened to just go through one of the slats of the barn and happened to exactly find the back of the neck of this other man in the barn. And supposedly that man was John Wilkes Booth. When I was 15, I was at a friend's house, just up the street from here, and saw a book called The Web of Conspiracy. And the very last page of the section where they have like pictures was titled Puzzle for History. And it showed a picture of John Wilkes Booth, and then a man who had obviously been deceased sitting in a chair. And he mentioned in that page that there was this alternative theory that John Wilkes Booth maybe wasn't the man killed in the barn, and that this guy sitting in this chair named David E. George, who supposedly committed suicide by poison in 1903, was really John Wilkes Booth. In the book, it mentioned a book by a man named Thonis L. Bates, who was friendly with a man who claimed that he was John Wilkes Booth, who ended up being this David E. George. The basic idea of that book was that there was a man who said his name was John St. Helen, living in a small town in Texas in the 1870s. And his best friend and his lawyer was this guy named Thonis L. Bates. One night, John St. Helen got very sick and thought he was about to die. And he called Bates over and he said, "Before I die, I want to tell someone who I really am. I'm really John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln. Inform my brother, Edwin, if I die." The guy recovered. And a couple weeks later, he said to Bates, "Do you remember when I told you I was really John Wilkes Booth?" And Bates said, "Oh yeah, I remember, but you were very sick, you were hallucinating, don't worry about it." He says, "No, I really am John Wilkes Booth, and now that I've gotten it off my chest, I want to tell you the whole story." All of these things said to me, wow, there's something here. President resigns to publish historical research. In February, Nate Orlowek, SGA president, announced that he planned to resign from his office. President Orlowek retired to his home to continue work on a history book proving that John Wilkes Booth did not die when reported. Appearances on regional television helped the president to gain fame. So there I am, and here I am with my cabinet. John Wilkes Booth, in reality, was not killed by the federal government officers. In 1989, I decided to go on my vacation to Enid, Oklahoma. I ended up meeting with one of the prominent civic leaders, and he said, "You know, we've been trying to get the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, the NBC show Unsolved Mysteries, which at that time was one of the top-rated shows. 30 million people saw it every week, to do a story about this.
Did John Wilkes Booth escape Union troops at Garrett Farm, only to kill himself 38 years later in an Oklahoma boarding house? The history books say no. John Wilkes Booth died in 1865. 4 years later, his remains were returned to Maryland and buried in an unmarked grave in the family plot. Perhaps there rests the definitive answer to this unsolved mystery.
The very next day, the cemetery got a call from some of the descendants of John Wilkes Booth, collateral descendants, saying, if these guys want to exhume that body, don't let them. The same day, I got a call from the Smithsonian Institution, and they said, we would love to do an exhumation, and we want you to let us do the examination of it, because we're the Smithsonian Institution. Of course, I was delighted that that was the case. They were going to do dental records, and particularly something called photographic superimposition, where you take pictures of someone, and there are about 100 pictures that everyone agrees are of John Wilkes Booth, and you superimpose it on a skull. If it matches, it doesn't mean it's the same person, but if it doesn't match, it can't be the same person. And when they showed all the evidence that we had to the extended family, 21 of the 22 descendants agreed that we were probably right, and they signed on to it.
Hi, I'm Joanne Hume. I should have just gone, what do you want me to say? Do you want me to say I'm a descendant of the Booth family? What do you, just give me how far you want me to go. Well, somewhere between 5th and 6th grade, the summer that I was going to be going into 6th grade, apparently I was being dramatic. And my mother said, oh, stop being so dramatic. She said, you're just like your relatives. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, you're related to a family of famous actors. So I said, oh, who? And she said, oh, Edwin Booth. And I didn't know of too many other Booths, so I said, oh, is he related to John Wilkes Booth? And I just expected the answer to be, don't be ridiculous, but the answer was, yes, he is John Wilkes Booth's brother. And then she kind of like took a breath and then said, listen, you're going to be going into 6th grade, you're going to be learning about the Civil War, and I want you to understand now, they're going to tell you that John Wilkes Booth died in the barn. He did not die in the barn. He lived many, many years afterwards. The family always knew it, and that you're just going to have to kind of learn to live with the fact that what you're being told is incorrect. We were just trying to get permission to exhume this body from the cemetery. We didn't think anything of it. We just thought, okay, let's dig this person up and let's see, are we related or are we not related? And you know, when my mother finally died, and I always say she really died of a broken heart, and she just said, I want to know who's in there. If this is not John Wilkes Booth, then we need this person out. If it's John Wilkes Booth, then that's fine, then we know.
And so it was all set to be done. The Smithsonian was all set to do it. And then a group of historians who believed that Booth was killed in the barn contacted the president of the cemetery, William Trimble, and convinced him to try to block it. As a human being, I am fallible. I've made many mistakes in my life. And in fact, I may even have made a mistake in concluding that John Wilkes Booth wasn't killed in the barn. I'm not 100% sure. As I often say, it won't be the first time I was wrong about something. There's no shame in being wrong, but there is shame for historians, people who call themselves historians, to block an attempt to get the truth. Greenmount Cemetery knows what the right thing to do is. And in fact, it would be much more scientifically feasible to do an exhumation now.
So I originally met Nate about 2 years ago. Originally, Nate had just asked some questions. If we have this type of material, if we have these bones, would it be possible to get DNA from them? To address the question of the identity of John Wilkes Booth, we would need a biological sample from the person who died in the barn, because that's what we're testing to see if we can identify that person. And DNA is essentially useless unless you have a comparison sample.
The plan that we recently were going to do was to take the DNA from one of the 3 vertebrae that were taken out, according to all accounts, were taken out of the man killed in the barn. They've been at the National Museum of Health and Medicine all along. And we can now compare the DNA there with the DNA from his brother Edwin Booth, who's the only member of the family not buried in Greenmount. If the DNA in the vertebrae have the same mitochondrial DNA as Edwin Booth's, it actually wouldn't completely prove that they're brothers. It would just prove that they're related. But even I would concede at that point. However, if they did not match, then with absolute 100% certainty, they couldn't be brothers. If they're not related, they're not brothers. And so within 5 minutes, we'd have the answer.
If the museum were to grant our request for a sample for genetic analysis, they would just be cutting a very small portion of this bone, just a small enough amount as you see in this test tube here, and that would be enough for us to be able to perform the genetic analysis.
Unfortunately, now just a short time ago, we received the answer from the Department of the Army that even though they themselves say that they're tempted to do this, that they do not want anything that's going to destroy their specimen, despite the fact that our expert says it won't destroy the specimen.
On the one hand, I completely understand, because in order to do any type of DNA analysis on bone, we do have to destroy a very small amount. But on the other hand, the technology is so sensitive today that we would use a very small amount. Just 0.2 grams of starting material of bone powder is all we would need in order to do this type of analysis.
We, the American people, own that museum. And we, the American people, have a right to know the truth. Why are we spending millions of dollars to run a museum if when the biggest crime in American history, the issue of what happened to the man who killed, in my opinion and in most people's opinion, the greatest president we ever had, but they won't even give us a fragment of their specimen. Why on earth do we have specimens? When would it ever be used? The American people should insist that this museum that we own let us do this test and get the truth out, whatever the truth is.
There are DNA hits being done all the time. Like I said, if you can find Richard the Lionheart under a parking lot, and if you can find Copernicus in the ruins of a church, and you can prove these people are related to and are who they are, then I just don't understand why history does not want to be either confirming this is history correct or this is history incorrect.
I am a scientist at heart. I want to be able to use the scientific method and be able to approach these questions unbiased. It just seems like there are so many things that could have potentially happened that we might not know the answers to. And in terms of trying to solve this mystery, it seems like the DNA might be the only chance we have to do that.
I just feel with what I know and what I've been told and what I've learned, I don't know that I would ever believe. If the government came and said, okay, we have proved that this is John Wilkes Booth, I would have to say, okay, how will you prove this to me? I don't care who else you prove it to me. So I don't see it putting it to rest, and now, and I think that's what people are afraid of. They don't want to change history of 150 years ago. I don't want to change history, I just want to know.
At every step of the way that we talked about, I felt like the story had, so to speak, ended, because my goal always was to just do the best I could. The only people who lose are the ones who don't try. Even, I think, our bitterest opponents would grant that we've given them one hell of a run for this. And so I have never felt anything other than that we've succeeded. Other people now have to step forward and do their part. If they do, we can all, in the end, we can all win if we get the truth.